Greetings from Common Notions Press. We're proud to convene this short online series, Raging Against the Machine, a popular school against AI. Together with Hagen Blix, co-author of Why We Fear AI, our program will address the problems, possibilities, and politics that haunt our understanding of AI with some of the leading critics, writers, and thinkers of our time. We aim for these conversations to be a modest contribution to the political education many are searching for around and against AI, and hope they offer some much-needed context and reframing, and sharp anti-capitalist class analyses that can enrich collective organizing and resistance efforts. Please do subscribe to this channel and our newsletter so you can easily find the next conversations in the popular school. Today's panel is titled Artificial Intelligence Gathering, AI, State Power, and the Far Right. Joining us are Hagen Blix, a cognitive scientist, linguist, AI researcher, and writer. Together with Ingeborg Glimmer, Hagen is co-author of Why We Fear AI. Ali Al-Khatib is a researcher based in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Drawing on computer science and anthropology, he studies administrative power and algorithmic harms and writes about navigating and destroying systems of oppression. Dan McQuillan is a senior lecturer in critical AI at Goldsmiths, University of London, and author of Resisting AI, an anti-fascist approach to artificial intelligence. And finally, we have Zirak Talep, who's a Chancellor Fellow in Responsible Machine Learning and Artificial Intelligence at the Center for Technomoral Futures and the School of Informatics at the University of Edinburgh. Zirak is also a faculty fellow at the Distributed AI Research Institute. So welcome and thank you all for joining us today. And Hagen, I'll kick it off to you to offer us a few opening remarks.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming. Thanks everyone in the audience for listening. We're talking about AI and fascism today, essentially. AI and state power, AI and repression. The topic could unfortunately not be more timely. We are right now seeing the military being deployed in Chicago in the US. They're doing airdrops on buildings, arresting everyone inside, ISIS everywhere, abducting people in Europe too. We see that the far right in many countries is on the move. And we are also seeing that AI, unfortunately, plays a major role in some of the politics of the far right? We can see this from propaganda to the efforts to dismantle the regulatory and welfare state through things like Doge, to actively spreading terror through things like the State Department's use of artificial intelligence. So I'm glad that you all joined me here. I think the hope here is that we can together have a fruitful conversation to clarify and sharpen our understanding of the politics of artificial intelligence, our understanding of what is going on, and of course, ultimately do this in the service of trying to figure out what we can do about it and how we can build a better world that is free from fascism. So I was going to jump in, talk about a couple examples of the intimate relation between AI and fascism that we're seeing right now, and maybe think about how do we go beyond maybe some more liberal critiques of AI that think about AI primarily in terms of things like hype or scam or whatever. And then I'll try to link that a little bit to larger questions of politics and fascism in a way that hopefully will be a good point to kickstart what you guys have been thinking about. So I think if you look at just the normal liberal media, if you read The Guardian, or you look at what's a kind of AI critical column in the New York Times or something like that, you often find the kind of strand of AI critique that where the companies are saying, oh, this thing is going to do amazing things, and then the critics are saying, oh, that's actually total hype, that's bullshit, it's not going to do that. And of course the critics are usually correct, but there is some real sense in which it also often misses the point, right? So one example that I've been thinking a lot about and that people have started really writing about is the production of terror. So one of the things that we could talk about is the State Department's use of artificial intelligence in the US right now. The State Department has started using language models to mass process social media posts of people who are here on visas, of immigrants. And the State Department is doing that in order to find people who may have said the wrong thing about Palestine primarily, right? So what is the State Department's purpose in doing this? The State Department is trying to produce deportations, because that is clearly a policy of this administration. And the State Department is trying to suppress particular kinds of speech, right? And in many ways, the questions of, oh, does AI actually work, is besides the point. AI works clearly well enough to do that. It is producing terror. And even if what we can call from a purely technical level errors, sometimes the machine will pick out a post as pro-Palestinian speech that maybe was pro-Israeli speech, or maybe it was talking about something totally unrelated to Palestine. It still picks out something. The less you can comprehend what the State Department is actually doing in the individual case, while still understanding the overall pattern of the speech that they're attempting to suppress, the harder it is actually to deal with that, right? So the more terror is unpredictable, the better it works to actually have its intended effects, right? Stochastic terror is much more effective than just banning a particular term, for example, right? People know how to get around that because it's legible. So the thing that appears as an error from a technical side can often appear as a feature for things like suppressing speech, right? Similarly, we have heard a lot of correct critiques around how language models and AI more broadly will always continue to hallucinate, right? Like there's no sense in which language models have access to an epistemology or some kind of sense of ground truth, because they ultimately operate only on language. And they don't have a sense of there's an outside of language, there's a world that language relates to, right? You could say language models are postmodern in the derogatory false sense, right? But again, this makes them very resonant with a particular kind of fascist speech, which is to produce speech not as some kind of good faith debate where we're together trying to figure out what is a better world, what is the truth, whatever kind of, whether you're talking politics or science or whatever, but using language purely as a play of power, right? We know that fascists continually lie, but they're not even lying in the sense of they're trying to get us to have false beliefs. They're using speech for the affective resonances that it's supposed to produce, right? They're trying to get us angry about something or scared about something, but they're not interested in having a coherent kind of view of things. And in that sense, again, I feel like AI really lends itself to those kinds of things, right? There's a resonance between the inner workings of AI and the way that fascism operates. And so taking these kinds of starting points of, like, if we think about AI not just as a technology, but as a technology that has maybe affordances, things that it lends itself to being used for that align very much with a particular kind of anti-democratic power, then we can maybe explore some of that together and maybe link that to larger properties of both fascism and also, I think, something we could call the exhaustion of liberal capitalism and its inability to produce a positive vision for the future. So some of the things that we, for example, explore in the book and that critics like Timnit Gebru have talked about is that we think about these language models as unscoped, right? We're simultaneously told that AI is going to be able to do everything, but then from an internal engineering thing, it's like, no, the scope is there. They're predicting the gap in the training data, but it doesn't have any particular concrete, well-defined purpose, right? So one way that shows up is like not having any real purpose gets sold as having a general purpose. And we can talk about how that all of that is linked to the power fantasies that go along with this kind of tech bro thinking, right? Like I think Timnit Gebru, for example, has linked that very clearly to the whole what they call the TESCREAL bundle, right? The idea of post-humans, which always has this very strong eugenicist undercurrent. The power fantasies of making the successor species to humans, right? Eric Schmidt is talking about humans as the bootloader for some kind of post-biological life. That I think that unscoped nature and the power fantasies of we are creating a new life form are somehow very related, and I think they seem to me very related. This unscoped nature also to they have an idea of we can produce a technology that's somehow fascinating, but they don't have a vision for what kind of world would be good to live in, right? So, and I think that is a property of capitalism at large that we're in right now, right? That whether you're talking about the right or the center-left liberals, there's a deep sense of there's not a positive vision of the world that they can offer. There's not an ability to say something useful about climate change, right? There's a sense of looming disasters, of the polar crisis that is on the horizon, and this deep sense of not having idea for what to do about it shows up both in the concrete technologies that they're building, where's AI, right? Like even people like Sam Altman are constantly saying that the future that it's going to be so unbelievably good that he doesn't even know what it would contain, right? There's a deep absence in the center of these things and in the overall political system that we're living in, right? Where the I think psychological result is an utter nihilism, a scam culture, hype culture. I think that's also why some of these critiques of calling it scam and hype resonate so deeply, because there's a deep sense that that is all that we are currently being sold. So I would love to talk about how can we diagnose this in a way that resonates with people's feelings, that can get people politically activated, that gives us the chance to build political alliance, form political movements that can offer a positive alternative, both in the utopian sense, just of like having a sense of what could a good future look like, and in the non-utopian sense of what can be the social forces that can actually achieve a better world. So very glad that you're all here to talk with me about this. Very glad that the audience is listening to us. I hope that this will obviously go well beyond the four of us and become a broad thing that many people participate in. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Hagen. Should I go ahead and just start talking, if that's okay? I don't know if I have all of my thoughts totally coherently organized, but I was writing down some of the thoughts about kind of what made me so excited about this book when I first started getting into it and when I first found out about it and started reading it. And the thing that kind of kept coming up for me was that I had been reading and thinking about state power and algorithmic power kind of together as these kind of parallel ideas for a number of years. And I was constantly encountering computer scientists and technical experts of AI who were constantly grading against this idea that AI was a thing that you could sort of liken to kind of political projects. And I think that over time, I became more acutely aware of the way that AI is, I would argue, probably more kind of coherently defined as a political project than it is a technical project or whatever. And yet I was still finding people who were really reluctant to engage with the idea of AI as something other than a scientific endeavor or an academic endeavor or whatever you want to call it. And so it was so relieving and so exciting to see something like Why We Fear AI that didn't just have thoughts about AI as a political, as an economic, as a social project, but also had like really coherent and strong opinions about machinery and systems and technologies from the 17 and 1800s. And it was important that you understood how these things worked. It was important that you, like, it was clear that Hagen and Ingeborg wanted you to understand specific ideas about how these technologies, how these interventions into society affected and changed the relationship between workers and management. And it wasn't just there to flex. It was a core part of making sense of AI in its current form today. And so I was so excited when I got to start to read this book, because it allowed us to start talking more kind of coherently, and it's hopefully going to allow us today to talk more tactically about what it means, in my opinion, to think about AI as a political project or a political economic project, and what it means to engage with that, to navigate that space, and hopefully to challenge and push back on that kind of project. I think that one of the frustrations that I had about thinking about AI before I read Why We Fear AI was the broader sort of common narrative, and maybe this is me as a computer scientist sort of coming from that space, of computer scientists sort of taking a kind of authoritative monopoly on who can talk about this, who has authority, who has experience with the systems that we're talking about. And I felt like Why We Fear AI didn't just sort of wrestle that narrative out of the hands of technical expertise and technocrats, but kind of put it back into the space of who has experience with administrative, with managerial power, with oppressive sort of state power, and all of these sorts of these qualities and these phenomena that I think anybody who has experienced, who has ever worked, who has ever been in a state, anybody who has these kinds of experiences or knowledge of oppressive systems now sees themselves as active participants in doing something about this project of AI. And so I'm so excited to get to chat with people here, with Z and with Dan and with Hagen, about this framework, this way of thinking about this, because it's not just about Why We Fear AI. It's not just about talking about AI as a different kind of thing than maybe 5 or 10 years ago people were very commonly willing to talk about it. But it's also about bringing into the conversation people who have experience but don't necessarily have, I think as Hagen and Ingeborg were talking about it in the latter half of the book, there's this difference between sort of knowledge and intelligence, or credentials and intelligence and knowledge. I think that there are so many people who have the knowledge of experience of oppressive systems and oppressive power, but they don't have the credentials about it, but that doesn't mean that they don't have a place in this conversation. And I think that the turn that this book introduced in my mind was the kind of turning towards actualization of bringing people into the conversation who have a stake in this, on the basis of the fact that they have a stake in this. So I'm just really excited to get to chat more, and I'm really excited to get to chat with Z and Dan and Hagen.
My turn. So yeah, I mean, I think the just rolling on from what both you guys have been saying, particularly just what Ali finished with, I think I wouldn't describe it as a political project, AI, but as a techno-political project. And I think that's one of the things that the book, and actually all of your work, really has, worked for me in doing, is, it's reuniting the politics and the technology. That we know that politics has never existed without technology. We've never existed without technology. There's no human subjectivity or existence without technology. We define ourselves and we become through technology, and our societies do the same. And so therefore, the particular technologies that we have and what their latent, I think Hagen might have used the word affordances, what their latent characteristics are and so forth, have direct political implications, not necessarily 100% deterministic, but strongly shaping. So I think, would I understand the common objective analysis here would be techno-political. And I think the book, brings it down from these somewhat mythic fears that are so nakedly mobilized for the purposes of marketing and sort of capital accumulation, and just says, well, actually, yes, these are expressions of nightmares that exist in the everyday, because actually this system is itself a nightmare. But on a much more ordinary level, that we have to sell our labor power, that nature is treated as an extractive resource, and so on. So I think it really does name the fact that what we're talking about here is the conditions of everyday life, and AI is a condensation and exaggeration, amplification, acceleration of all of those conditions. That's what makes it so horrifying, but it's also what makes it interesting. That's what makes it an interesting object of study. I mean, I'm in a computing department, and I am a bit nerdy, but computers by themselves are quite a bit boring, to be honest. AI is not, because it penetrates the world in such a profound way. So what I'd like to focus on, sort of coming back to the beginning of Hagen's presentation as well, is absolutely not to dismiss any of the sort of fascistic, instrumentalization of the capacities of AI where it has got to. But I'd also like to emphasize the commonalities between the characteristics of AI and the conditions of emergence of fascism in the first place. Why we have idiots like Trump or Nigel Farage here in the UK or whatever. These people are fools, demonstrably, laughable characters. You wouldn't sit next to on a bus, and yet they have acquired a lot of social power. What is it about the rest of us? What is it about our social relations and our own subjectivities and our lack of capacity for agency that allows these things to happen? And to my mind, what I ask is, what is it about AI and the process that have brought AI into being that represent and characterize the creation of those conditions of passivity, those creations of the conditions of hierarchy and authority? Hagen mentioned eugenics. I think this is absolutely fundamental to the character of AI and actually the underlying character of these societies. I mean, liberal society to me is a fundamentally eugenicist society. It's just whether or not that's sort of nakedly mobilized, which of course it increasingly is right now. So yeah, I said I wasn't going to talk too long. I've already rambled. I just want to finish on a bit about the sort of maybe the conjoining thing between these sort of fascistic dimensions, which is the use of AI, the use of a stochastic technology for stochastic terror. AI is essentially a computational form of conspiracy theory anyway, the AI that we have. And the role of AI in its abstraction and its creation of thoughtlessness, its algorithmic states of exception, so it's a centralizing of the other, its capacity for doing all these things, how it helps create the conditions of fascism. The joining point is kind of why now? What is it about fascism that leads to its emergence now? What is it about that brought this particular kind of AI into being? What is it about this moment? And what I'd just like to leave there is the sort of multiple crises in the existing system. AI would be bad enough if it was yet another layer to neoliberalism, but neoliberalism itself is coming apart, it's fracturing, and the sooner it's dead, the better. But there's an interregnum now. We're having a transformation. There are transformations of different kinds going on, and AI is playing a part in that. What is it leading us towards, and where would we rather go?
Cool. Okay, I guess I'll go next. Okay, so if we start with the praise, one thing that I really liked about the book, because all of my training has been in computer science and some cognitive science, but really quite minimal compared to the computer science, is that as someone who also enjoys reading about politics and the political economy, but is fairly my reading on that is based on interest and not any kind of structured process of learning, that the book really made it incredibly easy to access the kind of thinking and the links between politics and class and technology and how they kind of work together and that they have certain affordances together in a way that I think is incredibly easily accessible to non-experts, but also I think people with even less exposure to this than I have, because it is so it is written for, it seems to me like an educational piece more than anything else, right? But one thing that I kind of wanted to draw on and was your comment, Dan, about what it says about, or what AI really says about the rest of us rather than the far right. Because I think one of the things that is happening, through my work on content moderation and hate speech, what I've really come to learn and understand is that I don't really care about the far right. The far right is a movement that happens, but what's really interesting here is how there's not really a leftist alternative, and that leftist alternative, when it is there, is substantially undermined by the center. We saw in the French elections that when the left got together, provided a united front, and got the votes to win that election, the result was then to not give them the presidency, but to actually, or the presidency of the parliament, but to actually move over towards a right-wing candidate who didn't have any kind of majority vote, right? So we know what the center is interested in. It's not interested in supporting necessarily people's voice or leftist movements, but it's interested in kind of continually undermining this. And in that, I think the comment you made on the perlocutionary force of language and these technologies was really, really sharp. I really enjoyed that because it kind of gives me language, at least, to think about how exactly the stochasticity or the randomness, the nonsensical nature of AI plays so well into the factor of fascist forces, of right-wing forces, and precisely go in and undermine leftist tendency and leftist movements, right? Because for want of being able to communicate clearly and concisely,
the left always, like very often, communicates in, well, things are complicated, things are nuanced. We need to actually sit down and discuss these things and make sure that we have a good understanding before we go out and say things. Whereas on the right and the fascist end of it, they're like, well, we don't actually care about factuality or anything of that sort. We don't really care about about whether we seem consistent or we have a clear understanding of things. What we care about is that we get our message out, and our message needs to be whatever is most popular, whatever can draw crowds, right? And so I really I'm really kind of looking forward to this conversation, enjoying this, because it's giving me a lot of new language to think through these things.
I think that's a really there's a thread that's kind of going through some of these about like thinking about what is our role, as people who maybe somewhat professionally think and write about this. And one of the, I think, really crucial things is exactly not to say here's just what's happening, but to develop a kind of language and analytical tools that people can use in their own context to both make sense out of discomforts and repression, etc., in their own life, but also understand how the shit that they hate about the world that they concretely live in is linked to other people's stuff, right? Like, in a sense, I think a good theory is always about producing opportunities for solidarity, right? Like to see how your misery is related to someone else's misery, how your emancipation is bound up in someone else's emancipation, right? And in this case, for we're now a relatively like technically heavy group in this particular chat. I think that I've been thinking about how to include people who work, for example, in Silicon Valley. We're going to have a whole nother chat about that, but I think that sense of like, you want to build something. I love technology. Technology is fascinating to me. I agree with what Dan said about these things. These things are interesting in a weird way, right? But I am also deeply aware of the fact that we live in a society where the development of technology isn't just something that happens, but it's something that is always bound up in power, and where we build a lot on Harry Braverman, and he has all this beautiful stuff around how like the more science is used in shaping work processes, the more it is also used to remove understanding from the work processes, right? So one of the things, to bring it back to that like sense of utopia, is also to think about what would it mean to develop like technology, to live in a world where technology could be developed in a way that gives people more power and agency at their workplace, right? So what's a positive vision of technology? I feel like there's always a danger in being a tech critic to leave the field of what's a positive vision for technology open. And I think that is something that we really desperately need, because I think that sense of the polycrisis, of the interregnum post neoliberalism, of what Naomi Klein called end times fascism recently, right? That sense of an inability to imagine a future while they still build all this technology, that all like forms a new version of there is no alternative that isn't the neoliberal sense of this particular kind of capitalism is inevitable, but that I think builds this kind of climate change catastrophe, who gets to be in the bunker kind of mentality, right? So that drawing lines of whose humanity counts is, I think, crucial to their project, and it's crucial that we build a project that produces an alternative to that.
If I may.
Sure.
One thing that I've spoken to a bunch of people who are more senior to me in the field of natural language processing is the joy that they've gotten from different projects. And whenever I talk to them about this, without fail, they'll mention some incredibly specific project that they did for some small organization nearby where they worked. And then, that was what brought them joy. People who were working with these technologies later found them really meaningful and useful because they understood the technologies. They were part of the process of creation throughout it all. And where we kind of see this thing shifting, or where we're trying to seeing the trends going, is this notion of universalization of technology, that we build one technology or like one ring to rule them all, right? Instead of having different technologies for individuals or for individual uses, where people actually find understanding in them and how they work. Sorry, that was just the one thing I wanted to add with, because I think that there's a lot of space for positive visions the moment that we stop thinking about universalism.
I'd like to have a pop at the what's a positive vision of technology question. So I think, from my deployment of terms, thinking techno-politically or whatever, I think the 1970s for me are a really, really fruitful period of history, and it's maybe not coincidentally because that's really before the neoliberalism stuff kicked in. That there was a lot more talk then. It wasn't unusual then, at least in the UK, to have conversations about the social purposes of technology, and it was driven partly by arguments around automation and experiences of austerity, all of the usual stuff, but there was a social backing for it because you still had quite strong social movements. You also had the emerging feminist movement and the emerging environmental movement. Anyway, I like, personally, some of the ideas of Ivan Illich. I find that people have taken those and sort of moved on with them. So I love the paper on the matrix of convivial technology, which gives one a sort of Q&A on things you might ask a technology to consider whether it would actually be sort of beneficial in a broad sense. How it would affect relations between people. Is it understandable in the way that Z was just talking about? Does it lead to fruitful work? How does it affect our relations with the non-human, and so on and so forth? But in a way that's actually answerable, sensible questions, not poncy and not abstract and theoretical. And so I think it's not the only example. We can mine history. That's good, right? Because AI is a condensation of all of the things that people have been protesting about, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution or since the beginning of empire. So what that gives us, at least, is a trove of things to look back on and say, well, what do decolonial struggles have to teach us about what to do about AI and vice versa, and feminist struggles and so on and so forth. There's a really rich history there, both theoretically, practically, tactically, about how to tackle AI. So for me, for example, the opposition to AI is itself an opportunity to start that transformation of subjectivities that might lead to, because this answering of what is a better world is obviously an iterative one. The we that we are right now are not really best placed to answer it because we're so, tainted in a way by being so permeated by the values of the society, even though we think of ourselves as critical and struggling against it and all that kind of thing. We have to walk this path. But we can start, in ways that we can at least diagnose as positive. And so for me, it's like workers and people's councils, horizontal forms of assembly, and so on and so forth are a good start because they are a very practical way to say, no, do you know what? No AI in my workplace, no AI in my community, basically fuck off. But do it in a way that is collective and allows us to do a form of collective pedagogy at the same time about what it is we would like to see instead. And I think that the kind of current wave of AI, weirdly, is providing some great opportunities for that, because the infrastructure necessary for AI, it sort of smashes across so many parts of the world, across so many people's lives, across so many issues, that it gives us a kind of it's a bastardized intersectionality. By simply opposing the rollout of data centers, we can find the intersection of so many, or actually already existing struggles, some of which have been going on for 500 years, and new ones and environmental ones, and people are concerned about climate change. So actually, for me, it's almost like the reason for looking at AI is to invert it and say, what would the other of AI look like?
Yeah, I would like to chime in. I think that something that Dan brought up really fired a bunch of thoughts together for me. This provocation of using these technologies as an opportunity to ask, does this thing benefit people? Does it enhance people's autonomy? Does it give people more opportunities and more options to pursue the life that they want to live? And that being what should be the core of what motivates the kinds of conversations that we have whenever we're talking about any technology. But something that's really sort of salient to me that I think I wasn't really putting into words until now was that anytime you bring AI into the conversation, it's almost like it has this gravitational pull to it that affects the gravity. It has so much mass to it that as soon as it's in the conversation, it sort of drags everything to kind of gravitate towards orienting towards it. And so we do need to speak kind of sharply against these projects, because the alternative is to get dragged into the black hole that is this intense resource suck, this intense intellectual property suck, this intense kind of like system that changes political regimes, it changes legal paradigms, it changes all sorts of things around it. I mean, to the point about the data centers that Dan brought up, I mean, just nearby me, there's a data center facility that's being proposed that is somehow sort of exempt from any environmental regulation or any environmental sort of policies or requirements, because it's affiliated with certain projects or in certain institutions in the area. And the ability to say, actually, we're going to do a complete end run around what is the environmental impact of a facility such as this? What is the impact on careers? What is the impact on any of these questions that would otherwise normally provoke a conversation about, is this the kind of project that we want in our community? Really laid bare that I think for a lot of people who don't think about AI professionally, that what AI does is distorts the reality around which we can have conversations about how to make our society a better one that more people can live in, one that more people can thrive in. And I think that's a really interesting nexus point, like Dan was saying, through which we can think about how we organize and how we structure society.
Yeah, I also really like the way you put that down. That is exactly how I've also been trying to think about that. It's like, okay, here's an attack. I love the phrase bastardized intersectionality. It is coming for so many of us, and one of the things that I've been stressing in things like book events, because so many people from more professional backgrounds have been coming to those, is that a lot of people from sectors that have been relatively privileged, that whatever you want to call it, the labor aristocracy or whatever, right? But that have been relatively privileged and that have therefore been relatively hostile to the labor movement, or at least not a place where the labor movement has made a lot of like headway. A lot of people from these sectors, for example, are feeling under attack right now, and in a sense, there's a burgeoning class consciousness there, right? Like, so this sense of how do we use the fact that AI is coming for so many of us as an opportunity to also build very broad solidarity is really crucial. And I loved that you also said then we should link it to what's the other of AI on the technological level, right? Like these two, what is this doing to whom, and what's an alternative, and who can build it? That, like, connecting all of these questions and thinking about this as a threat to us that we need to respond to as the working class, but also as a moment that, precisely because it's coming for so many people across so many domains at the same time, that we can use as a clarification, as an opportunity to build solidarity between people who oppose data centers in their communities on environmental grounds. We know that those environmental grounds are, especially in the US, very often strongly along racialized line, right? So there's an anti-racist component to it. There's the opportunity to bring in new people into the labor movement. There's a real opportunity, precisely because these tools are coming for the aspects of jobs that people take the most dignity in, right? Like, one of the ways that I've been starting to think about it too is to say AI is a bullshit machine for making bullshit jobs, right? It takes a job that people took pride in and it transforms it, let's say you're a designer, and it transforms it into you now have to fix slop, and you can no longer take pride or joy in it, because the things that mean you are in control of your work are the things that you use to derive dignity and joy from your job, but it is also the very thing that capitalism in its logic always wants to move control away from workers from, right? Like, there's a big chunk in the book where we talk a lot about this kind of aspect, but that sense of taking pride in work, that can be like brought into that kind of coalition to really think about coalition building, to think about a positive vision for future and technology. You're still muted there.
Yeah, sensible technology, keep me out. Yeah, just a couple of quick thoughts to maybe sort of sow grounds of areas on which that kind of thought coalition might happen. One is energy. I think it's really interesting how. I've been doing some fascinating reading about the emergence of the concept of energy, its co-emergence with the Industrial Revolution, obviously, and even how we. But I was brought up as a physicist, and I never questioned the idea of energy as the scientific idea of energy, or let alone the conservation of energy. These things are not negotiable in a scientific education, but they also never explain to us how they also serve a political purpose. And then cascade down into ideas like productivity and efficiency, as if we're all supposed to accept these as unalloyed goods. So, but it's so funny how these data centers, the kind of thing that Ali's talking about, they're quite open about it. They don't even talk about flops, which is floating point operations, or the scale of GPUs or anything like that. They just say megawatts, or gigawatts. We got a 9 gigawatt data center. It's like they're telling us up front, which I guess is the spirit of the times. The fascists just tell you what they're doing, right? They're telling us up front, fuck. Excuse my language, screw you, basically. We're going to take the energy because we want it and you're not going to get it. Because what that really means in practice, of course, is power cuts for old people. The grids that we have are not going to be able to sustain this stuff. So, it's absolutely a form of, extracting things from everybody else at the very least, enclosure again, But so I think energy is one of those things. And the other one is something I've temporarily forgotten. So I'll shut up, which is probably a good thing. And I'll come back in a minute.
I do want to chime in and say there's also like one funny thing. This is getting into the weeds of the specific data center project that I'm aware of. That there are these like deep kind of collaborations going on between the data center proposal and the sort of local monopoly of energy production. And one of the things that the power company has promised is that they would invest in green and renewable technologies if the data center is allowed to go forward, which is a funny sort of promise to make, because it's like, oh, actually, so we could have green technologies, we could have solar technology, even in a place like Michigan, but only if we are willing to commit ourselves to these 100 megawatt data centers and these other things that obviously are going to take, they're going to completely eclipse whatever sort of solar production the power company is promising, but it's this like piecemeal thing that again is only contingent on us completely kind of rolling over and saying like, okay, sure, build this like enormous data center that will take up 5 times as much energy as the entire city in which it currently or in which it is currently proposed, and we can only have like this like modicum of something good if we're willing to completely abandon our principles and completely abandon everything that we're supposedly collectively working towards, which is again racial justice and correcting some of these injustices that historically we've all been part of. But yeah, I think that's I just think that's like a particularly funny kind of moment when the power company was like, yeah, we'll do like investments into the infrastructure and into green technologies, but only if this 100 megawatt project goes forward, as if they weren't completely undermining themselves.
Sorry, Z, because I'm sure you, because I remember my other thing, and it's very related, and then I'll really will shut up, which is organizing. To see AI itself as a mode of organizing the world, which obviously is, but to use that to raise the question of organizing around, for example, and related to this thing about energy, around scale. Now, something that I often hear in relation to movement organizing or political organizing, whatever, is like, yeah, your little local struggle is fine, but how do you scale it? And it strikes me as like a profoundly problematic question when scale, whether it's in the size of a data center, the number of GPUs, or to me that's completely fungible with the idea of GDP. The idea of infinite growth. Is a core of the problematic we're struggling with. So I think just using AI itself as a springboard to the question of how to reorganize, but how to organize in a way that's truly different. Anyway, that was get that in.
Yeah, the thing that I wanted to say was, jumping off what you were saying, Ellie, was I have lost count of how many times different companies have said, if you just let us do X, then we will do Y. That is a good thing. And then when push comes to shove, and like when they've done the thing that they wanted to, and it then comes time for them to build like these solar plants, for example, then that never happens. That never materializes, right? Like it's a promise of like, well, hey, we'll do this good thing that we know that you want, and like things that like there's broad kind of agreement globally on like we want clean energy, For some people, it's not because of fossil fuels, but just because it's cheaper energy, right? But so it's like, it really strikes me as funny that they're like, we will do this thing if you just let us do this terrible thing to you. And like, yes, there will be power cuts and we will lose all, like, your electricity bill will go up, but like, at least we promise you this data set, or like this clean energy plan. So I think that's one thing. But the other thing about organizing that I've been finding really interesting is that within my own community, within my own department of computer science, there's a lot more interest in organizing and thinking about organizing against these technologies, even as we are researching them and for some people developing them, right? There's a lot more saying, hey, we kind of acknowledge that the things that we're doing are harmful, which was not there just 5 years ago. It's really a recent thing where people are starting to say, okay, this might be bad. People are using these things for fascist things, or for fascist purposes. And I was talking to some people at a conference recently where, I was making the argument that AI kind of poses this threat to democracy, and that really we should be shifting towards organizing against this. And in spite of like initial pushback to the idea, everyone that I spoke to kind of came around to, okay, that this is actually a thing that we need to be taking seriously, and that the threat to democracy might be there. And so I think, like, to go back to what Hagen or what all of us have been saying, it's like, I think that there is a lot of scope for building broad coalitions. And I think that one of the ways in which we need to be careful here in how we move forward is to find the right way of including vastly different groups of people, right? To say that you might not care about racial justice. That might not be a thing that you care about, even if I believe that you should, but you do care about creatives losing jobs. Like that's kind of your selling point. We need to bring you into this, and like, we will get you over to also understanding how all of these things are interconnected and why you should care about racial justice. But to create that space to be able to say, we want you in the room, we want you to listen to us, we want you to kind of to organize with us and to build with us for a kind of better future. And I really like this idea of using that you had, Dan, of like using AI as kind of the binding glue to ask what the other is, right? And what organization looks like. And I mean, so I'm from South Asia, and one of the things that I kind of keep coming back to is the question of, do we actually need new methods, or do we need to resurface methods that have been whose histories have been destroyed, right? Because there's, like, Dan, you mentioned that there have been 500 years of organizing against empire, and I'm sure that we could draw a lot of lessons from how empire has been fought against.
Yeah, I mean, I could have I found everything you say there very resonant and very relevant. I think starting from the last point, I actually had the really interesting experience of doing a bit of work with the British Columbia Museums Association, who are working with lots of the organisations under them would be the kind of Indigenous and Native heritage organisations, First Peoples of Canada and so forth. And their first problem was the same as the rest of us, right? They're already overloaded. Along comes somebody flogging this tool that supposedly makes life easier. They want to know if it's a good thing or not. And you only have to talk about what AI actually is and what it does for about 2 minutes, and they go, oh yeah, it's that fucking colonialism again. They completely get it. They've been there, they've done that, they know about that expropriation and exploitation and all of that. And of course, I'm very familiar about how to resist it. So I do think that's really interesting. I think the Zapatistas are the interesting example, because they did that sort of fusion between those already existing ideas, or already existing relationality to non-human, already existing forms of communal organizing and everything that had been there for however long, with the sort of essentially class analysis, I guess, that came from sort of leftist urban guerrillas, essentially, and formed something completely different that articulated something that I got out of what you're saying, which is the lesson we need to take from recent movements, the idea of of a movement of movements, and not necessarily one size fits all, because again, that's the AI thing, right? Isn't it? You were saying yourself earlier on, we need to understand our mode of organizing and our mode of conceptualizing as being sort of fundamentally pluralistic and having this kind of capacity for difference or whatever. I just wanted to throw in not a spanner, but something to think about, which is, and following on from something that Hagen was saying a minute ago as well. I think when I wrote a book about this stuff, which was a mere 3 years ago, feels like a decade or two. I was very motivated by the idea of the need to bring this to people's attention. Because at that time, deep learning and so forth was something that was sneaking up through the bureaucracies behind the scenes, and it wasn't very visible. It seems to me now, there's already a backlash against AI. There's already resistances against AI of many forms. Of course, we should encourage those. Of course, we should help articulate those and stir them up as much as possible, right? But there is I really honestly believe a massive latent backlash against AI of many different forms emerging right now. But that in itself is a risk. Following on from what you were saying about the need for care, it's in the worst possible example, one might imagine that backlash against AI again being mobilized by the far right, as a sort of 5G towers, a revolution against technology because it's another thing that the elite have been sort of using against us, whatever it is. So what I'm trying to say is it's perhaps part of the task right now is not worrying so much about the need for there to be a resistance against AI, because there will be. It's in everyone's life and nobody fucking asks for it, nobody wants it. The question is, how do we guide? How do we help the coming to realization of those processes aim at the right enemy, which is the systems that produce the stuff in the first place, not actually the technologies themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Hagen.
Yeah, I really love that, and I absolutely agree with that. The task right now is to make sure that the movements against AI are inoculated against all the conspiratorial aspects to it. And again, it is very crucial, I think, there to point out how much AI itself lends itself to this conspiratorial view, because all the stuff that is coming from above, about superintelligence and whatnot, already has that weird conspiratorial vibe of, oh, here's an incomprehensible power that isn't really anybody, but that you can blame for things. It already has so much of that conspiracy theories thinking built into the discourse that the clarification of what are the systems that built this, what does this have to do with capitalism, with colonialism, with patriarchy, with racism, that is an extremely important thing to articulate and to clarify, but then also to say, precisely because there is this pushback in so many domains, I think the way to do this is, as somebody who's just co-written a book, is probably not to write more books, but to make sure that people from these different pushback movements start talking to each other. Because the real way you build anti-racism and anti-patriarchal forces and anti-capitalist forces is by bringing these experiences together and in a concrete organizing experience of experiencing solidarity, developing ties of mutuality where people don't just feel solidarity out of an abstract principle where they love humanity, but also out of understanding that the strategic shared interests and the ethical are both aspects of solidarity, right? Like to understand this solidarity in this very deeply practical thing. So I would love to see people, who are currently protesting a data center, go and join a picket line when the actors are on strike or the screenwriters are on strike, and vice versa, right? This is in a sense, precisely as it has come up through this discussion over and over again, precisely because it's coming for so many people at the same time in so many different ways, is the chance of building that kind of practical solidarity, practical connections between different kinds of communities that thereby can explore their shared interests through just actively assisting, right? Not through solidarity in some abstract way, but just being there on a picket line, just cook a coffee for somewhere, join a meal thing, whatever, right? Practical, concrete actions that help, where people help each other out, is the best way, I think, of building that solidarity. And we have real opportunities there.
Yeah, I will say something that I've been really pleased by. Again, this is me just speaking locally, and I can't speak to the broader sort of movements. but something that I've been really gratified to see has been that people organizing around and against the data center in my area, or the data center project in my area, have also been educating one another about the Zionist project, and have also been educating each other about creative workers and the egregious transgressions against their intellectual property and against their work. And I think that when you get a bunch of people in a room together, what you tend to find is that all of them have connections. They all have backgrounds and trajectories and everything else like that that bring them to share with one another their shared kind of frustrations and struggles, and then also sharing the unique things about themselves that that they are acutely aware of, or that they want to make sure that people are sort of like putting together. And so yeah, I was thinking as Dan was talking and thinking about specifically kind of the various groups of people that are resisting the kind of AI movement. And it's people who are sabotaging physical devices like flock cameras and Waymo cars and all of this other stuff, not just because these are autonomous vehicles, but because these are autonomous vehicles and autonomous devices and whatnot that also feed data to the police. They are also used specifically to inform state violence. People denying access to technical systems, denying technical systems access to vulnerable communities, people supporting, like you said, Hagen, people supporting creative workers on strike, going out and either donating money to strike funds or just coming out and physically giving food or whatever to people who are out on strike. All of these things are so heartwarming for me as somebody who has been really sort of like personally affected by watching the genocide of Palestine. But a thing that I'm also sort of acutely aware of is how protesting against the data centers is, I think, quickly going to become protesting against the government, or it's going to become sort of re-rendered as an anti-state kind of activity. And so I think, to Dan's point about how do we work with people to keep them safe as much as we can, how do we help inoculate against the state violence that's going to happen as a result of people who are protesting against what are increasingly becoming sort of federally or government funded or military funded data centers, facilities, projects, endeavors, and whatnot, that are not just physical facilities, but also collaborations with faculty and professors and whatnot in academia and universities. This kind of like synthesis between corporate and nationalist or government projects is not just a kind of toxic and terrifying thing on its own, but it also portends that it promises violence against people who just show up to protest against this kind of thing, because what they are talking about then is a protest against national security or something like that. Like, that is the kind of narrative that we're increasingly shaping up towards. And so how can we as researchers, how can we as activists, how can we as human beings help keep people safe as much as we can, and help these movements also become self-aware about the role that they are currently playing in fighting against this project, and the role that this project plays in other larger political movements.
I'm reminded by an example from Tong Wei Hu's book, and one of two people in the U.S. who destroyed some telephone infrastructure way back when the network was first being established and mobile phones were first being used, because of expensive charges, and the National Guard was sent on them, right, to find them and to kind of punish them because of the importance that the state put to the network state to kind of understand how the notion of surveillance and communication, or like broad communication, held together. And I think that this is a thing that I feel like I failed in communicating when I talk to people. And like, it's not just you using the tool for whatever your purpose is. It's also you contributing to this, to the craft or surveillance. And I've been thinking more and more recently more and more about what it looked like, what anti-surveillance tools look like, what are ways in which we can help people cover up their tracks. And hopefully I will start to work more actively towards building tools for activists to be able to say, okay, what are ways in which they can circumvent systems? And some of the things that I'm kind of inspired by are the anti-surveillance makeup and things like that, right? Which are really interesting. I'm not sure how well they work anymore, but like it would be fun to kind of see how these play together and what we can do as like show up to a protest and offer people, let's say, face paint, right? And to kind of say, we're going to help keep, like, this will help keep you safe, but also like communicate in group and say that we are all part of this community together.
All right, I think we're being asked by Common Notions to maybe do a little closing round. I think this was so far a really excellent discussion. I hope we can keep this up and spread this out and include more people in the future. Do you all have anything that you really wanted to add to the conversation that we haven't gotten to? Things that you think maybe the next conversation or a future conversation should be bringing in?
Okay, I'll have a pop. I mean, I think I think this idea of a generalized decomputing is a phrase I like at the moment. I might drop it at some point, but I like it at the moment. And I think it's for me, what the work that's trying to do is to address the incredible dependencies of society on technologies that are, irrevocably what Ali and Z were saying, destructive of sociality and a gift to autocracy and authoritarianism, by both sidestepping the sort of mute compulsion of this economic form of eternal growth and moving to something that is actually more like degrowth, but also re-establishing relations of sociality, the kind of thing that Hagen was emphasizing so much about solidarity. Any practical opportunity to have a conversation. I love that point about uniqueness. That I think it was Ali who mentioned it. Sorry if I got that wrong. But the one of the things that AI is completely incapable of doing, it seems to me, because of its very nature, its normative aggregation and abstraction is exactly that. There is an absolute uniqueness about all of us and our interactions. So any opportunity to build on that, to sort of recognize something familiar and interesting in each other, something valuable in each other, and that's worth defending together, is great. And AI gives us every opportunity to do that because it's penetrating our lives in so many ways. So I think the idea of a general escape from these infrastructures of dependence, actually, both material and I guess social, psychological, almost, in the subjectivities that are produced, can come out of saying a very simple refusal, actually, saying no to AI in higher education. In my case, no to AI. I had an amazing chat with my GP, which is my local doctor here, this morning when I went along with my cold. She said, "Oh, what do you do for a living?" And and we just had an amazing chat about her fears. To go back to the book title about AI in healthcare, were actually pretty well founded. So any opportunity to create this kind of solidarity in a day-to-day basis, but in that conversation to have that ambition that I think Hagen was bringing up right at the beginning, that every small act of solidarity or conversation or rationality is a first step towards a natural transformation of the whole of reality, which is where we need to get to. Easy to say.
Thank you, Dan. Ali or Z, either of you want to add anything more, or should I do some closing words? Okay. Well, that was fantastic. I think we really touched on implicitly here, kind of also thinking about how do we think about our own political structure building in the same kinds of terms, right? We're thinking about how do we get to have movements that are large enough that they can tackle the kind of global problems like climate change that we really do need to tackle, but without producing centralization, right? And these are both technical and political and techno-political, ultimately, problems, right? So I love that we're getting to points where we're thinking about our own movements and our own tasks that we set ourselves for an anti-fascist world, that we're trying to think about these in positive terms of how do we get to to connect many different kinds of struggles in a way where solidarity, where personal links, where communality can bring about collective action that isn't necessarily centralized. So I think, I think I loved this chat about the focusing on social agents, on opportunity, on building movements that can really change things. And I hope that many people will listen to this and have a lot of ideas that are better than whatever we had here, but that keeps going, that we hear back from folks, and that lots of movements get built and that lots and lots of movements connect. It was a pleasure. Thank you all for coming.
Thanks so much,
Yeah,
Hagen.
amazing. Thanks.
Thank you.
Well, I'll just echo Hagen's gratitude on behalf of Common Notions for each of our panelists, Hagen included, Ali, Dan, and Z, for offering us some pretty essential coordinates, conceptual, historical, strategic, but then also visionary about what we're facing in the problematic terrain of AI and state power in this very moment, but also how our collective resistance can combine and chart ways that we can find far, far better and more plural worlds. All of these things are essential to the popular school against AI that we are building. You'll find links to each of our panelists' bios and further opportunities to learn from their own work. And of course, you'll always find Why We Fear AI on the Common Notions website as well. So once again, thank you from Common Notions, and stay tuned for the next.